03 Alabaster potions. The elder nations from the time of the brothers Yatia, ancient Argiv, and Korli were decimated by the devastation of Argoth, and much of what is known of those times is now lost. In their wake, small independent city-states arose under the all-seeing eye of the Church of Tal. Each city-state was an autonomous entity, claiming fields and farms to supply their burgeoning population. The bulk of that population lived tightly packed within the city walls, so that plague and disease were more the norm than the exception. Arkal, Argivian scholar. Fosca did not show up at Ghed within the week, nor within the week following. By the third week Jodah was sure that something had gone wrong, and if there was no word by the fourth he would go back to also or Primata or No, and find out what had happened. Then the spotted plague hit Ghed, and the city was sealed. As plagues go, the spotted plague was more of an inconvenience than a pestilence, but it was enough to grind the city to a halt. One's joints swelled up, one's brow grew warm, and the skin erupted in a myriad of pin-sized red dots. It did not kill anyone, at least not directly, but it left its victims weak and unable to protect themselves from other diseases. So the city fathers closed the gates, sealed off the districts within the city, and in a few cases quarantined and burned several afflicted households. The plague had several effects within Ghed. First, it was assumed that it was brought from without, and since there was no sign of that particular disease from also or the Giva provinces, it was settled that it had to be from far off Almaz. Several Almazi traders were stoned to death in the streets before the city's noble council banished natives of that nation, for their own protection, and shipped them out. As a result, there would be few ships from Almaz for a while. Second, the Church of Tal experienced an influx of new members as many stragglers of the holy flock suddenly recalled their devotion and crammed the temples and cathedrals in order to ward off the disease. Of course, some more cynical citizens noted that close proximity with other plague victims might increase the chance of getting the spotted plague. Said cynical citizens also noted that, were they in the position of the church, they would deliberately spread such minor plagues to encourage the faithful. Of course, such heartfelt cynics said such things very, very quietly and only to other cynics whom they knew well and trusted. Thirdly, there was an influx of enlistment in the armed forces of Ghed. With the harbor and the gates closed, a lot of young men were no longer needed for the docks and fishing boats. Worse yet, the granaries were steadily dropping, and the army promised 2 squares a day, and that was 1 meal more than most young men were expecting at first place. The army also had church healers and miracle workers who could keep the brunt of the plague at bay. And finally, most of the citizens, especially the cynical ones, agreed that once the plague was mostly past, there would be maneuvers to grab as much farmland as possible before the harvest set in. There was a fourth effect of the plague, and one that most of the citizens would not speak of. With the plague, there was an increase of talismans, witchwards, plague wheels, and curatives within the city walls. All manner of potions, infusions, and poultices were used by the populace to stem the tide of the plague. Rune-carved gems were sold that guaranteed the safety of the water or wine, and scriptures written on thin scraps of goblin skin were wrapped around the joints to ward off swelling. There were 1,000 homemade remedies, bits of folklore, and invocations to forgotten gods that all promised some relief from the spotted plague. The church took a very dim view of all this, of course, so that any such home remedies or folklore cures were carried out away from official knowledge. All the potions, poultices, periapetes, and phylacteries were sold quietly and delivered in the dead of night. There was an ancient crone in the city named Mother Dobbs who, the neighborhood legend went, had the sight and, for a small fee, would concoct a potion capable of curing the spotted plague, or create a charm that would protect one from being struck down with the disease. Yet those desiring the curatives might be unwilling to visit her house and set down their money. A go-between was often needed, someone who was unafraid to walk the plague-haunted, night streets of Ghed. That someone was Jodah, for the time being. At least until the plague flag over the gate was removed and he could travel to also, or at least until he found Fosca again, and at least until he had saved up enough money to bribe his way on a ship out of the harbor. Each night he would take Mother Dobbs's folk cure to those who were too timid or prudent to fetch them for themselves. He would pick up the packages as the old woman retired for the evening and set out promptly on his rounds. Well, almost promptly. Of late he had taken to examining the potions himself, in his quarters in the attic of Mother Dobbs's house, before starting to deliver them. At first he sought to understand the cures, but later, aided by his knowledge of how spells truly functioned, he began to try to improve upon them. Up till now no one had complained. Jodah had 3 deliveries this evening, for each of which he would be paid a few coins, and sometimes an extra copper bit or 2 for his trouble. He always nodded in thanks and blessed the buyer for his gracious donation, but he knew that a few extra bits of copper would not aid him if the church caught him walking the streets with packages of folk curatives tucked beneath his shirt. Each of the packages contained a gypsum bottle, wrapped in a bedding of wool, set inside a box made of thin wood, and the entire package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Within the bottle was a viscous mixture of white, yellow-white, and gray-white fluids that, if left to themselves, would settle in 3 bands. For that reason Mother Dobbs instructed Jodah to shake the package hard, before passing it along, and instructed the buyer to consume the concoction as soon as he opened the package. The first package was to be delivered to an address unfortunately close to one of the numerous temples of Tal. It was one of the town houses that might be owned by a successful merchant or a minor bureaucrat. Jodah had learned not to inquire too closely about who lived where in Ghed, particularly since these people tipped well. This delivery came with instructions. He was to come to the back entrance, knock thrice, count to 5, and then enter. Jodah found such arrangements irritating, as if the potions were thought to be delivered by some magical pixie as opposed to a tattered, bearded youth. Still, such buyers often tipped well for Jodah's indulgence in ritual. Jodah took out the first package and shook it hard. He knocked 3 times slowly, then counted to 5 quickly. He threw the latch and opened the door to what seemed to be a servant's kitchen. The room was empty, the tables and cabinets cleared in anticipation of preparing the morning meal in a handful of hours. A work counter was set in the middle of the room, and the lone door out of the kitchen was opened a crack. There was money on the counter. Jodah knew what to do. He set down the package on the counter and started to sweep the coins into his hand. Then he stopped. The money here was twice the normal price that Mother Dobbs usually charged. Was there a mistake, wondered Jodah, or had Dobbs raised the prices of her mixtures without telling him? Or was the rest supposed to be a tip? He paused for only a moment, and there was a voice from the cracked door. "Is there a problem?" The voice was soft and warm and feminine. Jodah jumped at the sound of the voice, and looking up he saw the door swing the last fraction of an inch shut. Then he shook his head, swept the rest of the money into his hand and left. He closed the door behind him and was 3 steps away when he heard the bolt solidly shut home. Jodah looked at the kitchen entrance of the townhouse for a long moment, then moved on to his next delivery. The second package was to be delivered down by the docks. It was the area hit hardest by the plague, which was one of the reasons why the Almanza traders were blamed for the outbreak. He had to detour twice to avoid patrols of the night watch. In normal times, these consisted of 2 guards in black armor with green capes, generally bored and easily bribed. These were not normal times, however, and each night watch patrol was accompanied by a priest of Tal. This resulted in less boredom and less bribery, both of which disappointed the watchman to no end. As he moved toward the docks, Jodah passed the first of the quarantine signs. If all the members of a family succumbed to the plague, the church reserved the right to mark the house as quarantined and was forbidden to make any outside contact. Those within the house were left to survive as best as they could or to die of the disease. Then the house would be burned or ritually purified for future occupation. Jodah noted that most of the quarantined houses were in poor areas, and that there were few in areas that were loyal to the church. The wealthy could afford the priest's blessing, and if everyone in the house was stricken, they could simply hire more servants. It did not surprise him that the address he was given was marked with a quarantine letter, the official document stamped with the double sunburst of the Church of Tal. In the darkness the symbol looked like a blood-red set of eyes. Jodah walked past the address, then doubled back. There was no one on the street, not even the occasional drunk. The priests had little love of the poor, so patrols were few and infrequent. He saw a flicker of motion out of the corner of his eye, and Jodah turned. There was nothing there, but the hairs on the back of his neck rose. Since his escape from Al-Sowr, he half expected his ragged guardian angel to reappear at any moment, but for the past few weeks everything had been quiet. Was the figure that he had seen in Al-Sowr, and had seen in the forest, he was now convinced, more than just a chance encounter? He had looked for the ragged man among the beggars and cripples of Ghed but had seen nothing that resembled him. Jodah leaned up against the wall across from the address and waited for a full 5 minutes, but the figure that had flickered across the corner of his vision did not reappear, if it had existed at all. Then he crossed, removed the package, shook it, and quietly knocked on the door. The door opened immediately about a foot. A warm blast of air tumbled out and wrapped Jodah within a soft, enticing fog. Jodah fought the urge to inhale the contagious air of a plague house. Slender, palsied hands, shaking from fever, appeared out of the darkness and grasped the package, trying to tug it weakly from Jodah's grasp. "Payment first," said Jodah, his voice low. One hand let go and retreated into the darkness, then returned with a pair of coins. "That's only half," said Jodah, fighting the building urge to inhale and wanting to be away from the door when he did. "Please," said the voice, cracking wetly like a boil breaking open, "my boy, he's nearly dead. He won't live through the night without this." "That's only half," said Jodah again. "I've nothing else," said the wet, fluid voice. "When he's better, we can get the rest. Please." Jodah thought for a moment. The take from the first house would cover both that package and this and leave him a handsome tip as well. But what if Mother Dobbs had expected more money from the first house? Then it would be Mother Dobbs's fault for not telling him to charge the rich more. Jodah took the coins, and the package disappeared within the darkness of the plague house. He turned away and took 3 large steps before allowing himself to inhale. Turning away, Jodah again caught a fleeting glimpse of something darting around the corner, something that was watching him, something that pulled back as he approached. He walked toward the corner, but when he reached it, whatever it was that was watching had disappeared. The last drop was a merchant's shop, one that Jodah had visited time and again. Jodah was sure the merchant was not using the potions herself but rather selling them again, at inflated prices, to other victims and potential victims. Jodah would find the money in a wood box behind the main dwelling, near the midden, and leave the package in the box. However, now he was sure he was being followed, but he did not know if his pursuer knew that he knew. It could not be the night watch. They blundered down the streets and alleys as if they owned the city. A cut purse? There were better targets elsewhere, even in these near-empty streets. A spy for the church? Mostly likely, Jodah decided. Some concerned citizen, probably, who was following him, ready to report any violation of the law to the church, like visiting a plague house. Like carrying forbidden magics. Jodah lengthened his pace, and now he heard footsteps as well behind him. Soft footfalls, like feet in slippers, taking 2 steps to his one, struggling to keep up. He abandoned his intention of making the 3rd drop, instead placing the package within his shirt. Jodah took a right at the next corner and then a right again. The footsteps kept up with him. He paused at an alleyway, then dodged down it, confident that his pursuer was behind him. The alleyway was narrow and descended almost immediately down a flight of stone steps, their centers worn by the passage of many feet so that it looked as if the blocks themselves had melted. Archways littered both sides of the alley, with doors set deeply back from the stairs. Early upon his arrival in Ghed, Jodah had slept in such doorways. Now he pressed himself against a shadowed archway and awaited his pursuer. He did not have long to wait. There was a long shadow from the entrance of the alley, that slowly moved toward him. The shadow diminished as it neared, until it was smaller than he was. Jodah nodded to himself, at least it was too short to be his ragged guardian angel. Slowly and carefully, Jodah's pursuer walked right by him. Jodah lunged out of the doorway and slammed into the figure with his shoulder, hard. It was his intention to knock his unknown pursuer to the ground, then hold him down until Jodah found out why he was being followed. That was his intention, but his pursuer was too quick. The young man caught a portion of the figure's cloak, and then his pursuer wheeled, dropping neatly out of the way. Jodah's own momentum threw him forward and down a few stone steps. He shouted as he tumbled and struggled to regain his balance. He finally slammed against the far wall and felt something crack. A warm wetness dribbled out of the package held against his side, staining his shirt. He wheeled in place, but his would-be target had not moved from the spot. Instead, his pursuer stood in the darkness, waiting for Jodah's next move. Jodah shook the stars from the corners of his eyes and cleared his mind. He thought of his homeland and pulled from those thoughts the energies to power his magic. He had been practicing in Mother Dobbs's windowless attic, and could now pull the power of the land and think of his spell at the same time. He reached into the entranceway of his mental manor house and pulled forth the spell. And was too slow. As he readied the spell, the very ground seemed to slip away from him. It was as if the alley was a long rug, and his pursuer had grasped one end of it and shook it up and down, sending a quick series of waves down its length. Jodah's eyes told him that the alley was not moving, but his stomach heaved and pitched from the feeling that he was being violently battered. All thoughts of his own spell were lost at that moment. Jodah shouted and gripped the sides of a door archway in a desperate attempt to stay upright. Only slowly did the world stop spinning around him. The shadowy figure took 2 steps forward and held a hand, palm up, between the two of them. A small blue light flashed in the cup of that palm, illuminating them both. Jodah saw a young, female face, framed by dark hair that was cut in bangs. The skin was smooth, the features pleasing, and if Jodah were somewhere else he would have thought to compliment the young woman, particularly if she was pursuing him. However, at the moment the woman's soft lips were pulled back in a snarl, and her gentle brows were knotted in fury. "Who in Mishra's name are you?" she snapped. "What do you think you're doing?" "Doing," said Jodah. The world still rocked around him, and it was the best reply he could manage. "The potions, you idiot child," said the young woman. "What do you think you're doing with those potions?" Jodah blinked. "I just run deliveries. Don't know anything about." Then the young woman balled one hand into a fist, the one without the blue flame, and stomped her foot on the paving stones. "Don't play the fool with me, child. We don't have time for it." "I don't know what you're talking about," managed Jodah, wondering if he could talk and call on his magical energies at the same time. "Do you know what is in one of Mother Dobbs's potions?" she said, her voice dripping with venom. Jodah flinched at the mention of the name, and she continued. "Yes, I know who you work for. I purchased one directly from the old woman a few days ago." Jodah shrugged, and she continued. "Mare's milk, mineral oils, and the yolk of an egg. It could clear out your lower track, but that's all." "But do you know what the potions you deliver do?" Jodah's back stiffened, and a line of sweat dripped down his spine. He had been found out. "There's an odd difference between the potions the old woman sells and the ones that are delivered in the dead of night. The ones you happen to deliver really work. They clear the spotted plague, or whatever is afflicting the drinker." Jodah mentally cursed himself, but it had seemed so obvious to try and help Mother Dobbs' potions with a little magic of his own. He had hoped to just make them drinkable. He had never thought the difference would be so incredible or so obvious. The woman was talking again. And if I can figure this out, you can bet the church can figure it out. Again she made the foot-stomping motion. Who taught you to cast magic? Jodah blinked, suddenly realizing that he was being asked a non-rhetorical question. Pardon, he managed. The pursuer leaned close, and the light crackled in her palm. To Jodah it no longer looked like a flame but rather like a bit of a lightning bolt. Spells. Who taught you? Her face was as stern and cold as a statue's. Jodah leaned back. I am Jodah of Giva province. My master was Fosca. Now it was the woman's turn to be surprised. The dark eyebrows raised and disappeared beneath the bangs. Fosca? Where is he? I don't know, said Jodah. Felden's cane and crutches, she snapped, where is he? I don't know, said Jodah, realizing that he was shouting now. He lowered his voice but did not soften his tone. We were captured by the church in Alsoor and escaped. We split up. He was supposed to meet me here. He hasn't shown Alsoor, she said, bitterly. Then she turned slightly and looked back toward the alleyway entrance. When she turned back, her face had changed, still serious but not as angry. We have company. All your shouting, no doubt. Stay put, I'll lead them off. I'll contact you later. With that the blue flame was extinguished, and the woman became a cloak-shaped shadow again. She waved her palm upward toward Jodah's face, and Jodah caught a bright flash of blue light at the corners of his eyes. Then she was gone, almost flying down the broad steps of the alleyway. Jodah tried to stand and follow her but found that he could not. Whatever spell she had worked, it had robbed him of his ability to stay upright. He felt as if he was in the grips of a 3-day binge without even the benefit of tasting the alcohol. Jodah's stomach tried to climb up his windpipe, and he knew he would be looking at his evening meal if he moved too quickly. It seemed to be a localized version of whatever had knocked him off his feet earlier. Extremely localized and focused entirely on him. Defeated, Jodah curled up in the doorway, hoping the world would stop spinning again soon enough. That's when he heard the feet-heavy boots on the paving stones. He did not have to look up to know that the night watch was coming down the alley. He could not do anything about it, even if he wanted. The voices of the watch drifted up toward him like bubbles. What's this one? Said one of the guards. Drunk, said the other, or maybe drugged. No, said a third voice, something else. This voice was as sibilant as a snake's. And Jodah shuddered as the sound of it. There was a hissing noise. No, thought Jodah, sniffing, the one with the third voice was sniffing the air. Had he thrown up already and not realized it? Finally the third voice said, sorcery. There were spells here. This way. The first voice spoke up. What about this one? Leave him, said the hissing one. The church cares not for victims. Only for sinners. They were gone, the noise of their boots clattering down the alleyway. A small eternity passed. Nothing else thundered through, screamed at him, or otherwise inverted his world. Jodah concentrated on long, deep breaths, pulling the cool night air into his lungs. Finally he dug out the mirror from his right boot. Even in the minimal light of the alley he looked horrible. His face was pale and sweaty. His beard and mustache, filling out nicely, now looked like a black square framing cracked lips and a dry mouth. Jodah stared into the mirror until his face regained something akin to a natural color. Then he slowly pulled himself up and staggered back toward Mother Dobbs's. The church was there ahead of him. There were guardsmen in the black and green uniforms holding back the crowd as two priests escorted the old crone out of her home. Trapped between the two heavy priests, Mother Dobbs looked confused, unable to understand why the church had come for her now. She always made it to services, she tried to explain. Everyone knew about her little folk medicines. Why did they come for her now? Toward the back of the crowd, Jodah knew. The church left her alone as long as they knew she was a fraud, a seller of useless nostrums to a gullible public. The moment the potions really started to cure people. Thanks to him, he realized. Thanks to his own meddling. The priests helped Mother Dobbs into a donkey cart. Some of the people watching jeered at Mother Dobbs. Others just looked stricken, as if one of their favorite pets had been dragged away. Or, more likely as if her customers would be the next occupants of the donkey cart. One of the priests cracked a whip, and the mule lurched forward, carrying off the confused old woman. The other priest nailed a quarantine sign on the front of the door, emblazoned with the double sunburst of the Church of Tal. The seal was fresh and ran like wet blood. Then he followed the cart, intoning the praises and wisdom of the Holy Church. Jodah watched them go. Surely, he thought, they would let her go. They would find out she had no wizardry in her. That her potions and nostrums were fakes. The magic sniffer would get nothing out of her but a bad headache from all the incense she surrounded herself with. They would have to let her go after a few days. Wouldn't they? Jodah realized that once they knew that Mother Dobbs was harmless, they would go looking for the real wizard in the area. Her suppliers. Her friends. Her delivery boy. Jodah looked at the blood-red seal of the church and bit his lower lip. The next morning, under an assumed name, he enlisted in the Ghed army, and within the week, when the plague flag was finally pulled down, he was marching with a military unit north, toward also Ur.